The Wikipedia page on Sir's information is one of the lengthiest Wikipedia pages ever written on somebody.
I'm not even sure it's reliable. I'm not sure it's reliable information.
So, right, sir. It is as reliable as it gets because it's all very good things about you, sir. So let's say that it is reliable, right? So, sir is a politician. Sir has served as an international civil servant at the United Nations in the capacity of the Under Secretary General. Sir is a serving member of Parliament. Sir has been a Minister of State for External Affairs. Sir has also been an Education Minister. Sir undoubtedly is a voracious reader and therefore is also a voracious writer by extension. So one of the first books I have read about you, that you had written was The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone. And I'd be very honest, when I was preparing for this exam, I cut, copy, pasted your book, and that did really, really well for me.
Thank you.
So, very recently, you've also written a book on why I am a Hindu. And I remember in one of your old public speeches, you had also spoken about how Hinduism is one of the most convenient religions without any confirmed place of worship, culture, costume, and one of the most fundamentally beautiful things you've spoken about religion. And so on a personal note, many, many years ago, when I was judging a Model UN conference at a college in Chennai called Stella Maris, you were the guest of honor in that college, and I have had the pleasure to hear you speak, and life truly is a full circle. I could not be happier. So I honestly and most earnestly welcome you to the workshop. And I would like to also tell you that most of the students here on the platform are preparing for government services, and no better person to talk to them about government services who has been an international civil servant, a parliamentarian, and a minister. So please accept our heartfelt greetings on the platform, sir. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much, Mr. Mathur. Thank you. I really apologize again that we had this misfortune at the start. People have been waiting. We value their time. So let's go straight into it. And I thank you for your kind words.
Thank you so much, sir. And I'm sure a lot of people already know this. You are the only stand-up politician in this country with a very, very successful, the only politician who understands humor the way it should be. And we'll get down to business on that note, sir. Right, sir. So we are going to largely be discussing the idea of the paradox of the parliamentary system in India. And what we largely want to talk to you about is how India, as you know, is one of the largest democracies in the world, is still not one of the most efficient parliaments in the world. Now, whether it is qualitatively or quantitatively, and those are the finer discussions we want to talk about in terms of how almost half the population of this country is the female gender, and we don't even have 80 female MPs in the parliament. We have an exhaustive list of parliamentary committees, but we are nowhere close to the kind of work parliamentary committees in the West do. So we'll be looking at certain contradictions, some very specific questions that you may have your insights on, and we'll build a conversation over that, sir. So with your permission, may we begin with the first theme, sir?
Sure.
Thank you, sir.
Do you want me to say a few words at the start on this broader theme of the parliamentary paradox, or shall we just go into your questions?
The floor is all yours, sir. Please, sir.
Well, I mean, I have to say that for me, the fundamental paradox of Parliament, we all think of Parliament as a place where there's discussion and debate, but in India, the difficulty is the predictability of the outcome of most parliamentary debates. The government will propose, the opposition will oppose. If a vote is called, the government's brute majority will dispose, and the merits of the issue seem to matter very little. There are really no reasoned attempts to persuade the other side, or rather, when such attempts are made by the well-meaning, they will prove futile, since persuasion, reflection, and exchange are not the purpose of the exercise. Increasingly, parliamentary debates have become a ritual, the obligatory airing of opposing views until the whip is literally cracked and MPs duly vote on party lines. Even sensible suggestions by the opposition, with which the Treasury benches do not in fact disagree, are never adopted, since to do so would be to admit the possibility of flexibility into government legislation in the Lok Sabha. The only time that opposition views are taken into account is when the outcome of the vote would otherwise be uncertain. That is when the government, say a coalition with a narrow majority and one of the parties in the coalition may or may not vote for the government, that kind of situation. Otherwise, where the government is sure of its majority, the opposition views are simply disregarded. Right now, we've seen in our parliament that secure in its overwhelming majority, the government simply chooses not to listen, or to listen only with a closed mind. the idea of Parliament as a forum for collective deliberation and agreed outcomes has ceased to have any meaning. I mean, I have had a taste of this many times. One example I'll give you was a routine and non-controversial bill on labor rights, which my party, having initiated the reform itself in the UPA days, had agreed to support. The bill merely required that employees in companies of a certain size had the right to be notified of their rights in writing. And during its passage, I suggested that given that nearly a fifth of Indian men and more than a third of Indian women are still illiterate, 2 words should be added, orally and in writing. My logic, as I explained to my fellow MPs, was that while the bill's objectives were laudable in giving laborers knowledge of their rights in writing so they could be legally enforceable, the substance of those rights should also be conveyed orally so that illiterate workers could understand what they were entitled to. Now, this suggestion was entirely within the spirit of the bill. I saw several BJP MPs nodding their heads affirmatively at this common sense suggestion, but when the amendment was put to a voice vote, the ruling party erupted raucously in a vociferous chorus of no. My proposal was negative because the whip issued by their party was to vote in a certain way, common sense be damned. That's a very small example of how little real give and take there is in our parliamentary system, especially after the anti-defection law inaugurated the practice of party whips on all issues, making receptivity to the ideas of the other side actually punishable, even with expulsion from the House. Now, there's nothing about my idea that need have upset the ruling party, or that went against its ideology or its interests or the substantive purposes of the bill. But the debate that was scheduled on the bill was never intended to influence the terms of its adoption. It was just a ritual. You have to have a debate before you vote, but the outcome was preordained. The bill would be passed without change, and so it was passed. Now, what one might ask is the point of such debates at all, other than to nail one's colours to the party mast? Why should a serious MP exercise his grey cells to come up with constructive suggestions if they're never going to be considered, let alone adopted? Now, this is not how it was meant to be. Parliament, of course, is a British invention, and their conception was supposed to be a forum where individual MPs of ability and integrity met to discuss common problems and come to agreed solutions. There's a very famous speech by Edmund Burke, a speech to the electors of Bristol in 1774, in which he actually articulated the classic explanation of the logic of Parliament and parliamentary representation. He was addressing the issue of MPs being asked to advocate the wishes of their constituents rather than themselves. But his logic applies also to the issue of MPs parroting their party lines. What he said is, yes, the MP must be in touch with his constituents, or you can say in the Indian context with his party. Their wishes ought to have great weight with him. He must have respect for their opinions and so on. But his own opinion, his mature judgment, his conscience should not be sacrificed to any other institution, individual, or any set of individuals living, because those are his own, they're a trust. His own intelligence, his own education, his own ideas are a trust, and that he is answerable only to Providence for that. So he said, your representative owes you not his industry only, but his judgment. And he betrays it instead of serving you if he sacrifices it to your opinion. So in other words, an MP betrays his voters and himself if he surrenders his better judgment to the dictates of either his constituents or his party leadership. And Burke explained that government and legislation are matters of reason and judgment. And if something is predetermined before the discussion, then how is he applying his reason? How can you have one set of men deliberating somewhere behind closed doors, another deciding, and perhaps that the conclusion is formed by people who are not even present inside the parliament? But in India is very true because most of our laws are drafted by bureaucrats. Right. Now, I'm sorry, were you interrupting?
No, sir, I was agreeing with you, sir. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. So just to say that, I mean, the fact is that ultimately, if Parliament is meant to be a deliberative assembly of the Indian people trying to act in the Indian national interest, then obviously the party whip ought to be very secondary. It should be very much, and in fact, to quote Burke's famous line about this at the end of his speech, he said, you choose a member indeed, but when you have chosen him, he is not a member of Bristol, he's not a member of your party, he is a member of Parliament. Now that is the nub of the entire issue. Prime Minister Modi speaks of Parliament as a temple of democracy. But is a temple merely a place to ratify decisions made elsewhere in party cabals or cabinet meetings, whose adoption is rendered inevitable by the majority given to you by your previous general election results? Or is it a chamber where the representatives of the Indian people assemble to express their considered opinions and thoughtful disagreements before coming to an outcome in the interest not of a party but of the country as a whole? And, we'll talk about the anti-defection law if you like. I don't want to take up too much time in this initial statement. But my concern is very much that has been a particular factor in restricting MPs' abilities to express their free views. And in India, we have a situation where there is essentially no freedom of conscience to the Indian MP on any issue after the passage of the anti-defection law. So we can discuss that in more detail because I haven't given you my reasoning for it. But just to say that we really have to grasp this issue seriously and demand a reform. Otherwise, the parliamentary paradox will continue to undermine what a parliament is or should be all about.
Right, sir. So, in fact, so on a slight anecdote, at the Clifton Circus in Bristol, there's a cartoonish caricature of Burke's Court, which today is very often, visited by the graduates of the Bristol University. Very close to that is the Bath University. It's almost a place of shrine for political science graduates, and it's something very interesting that you brought that out. So, fundamentally, what we've done is, and as you have most beautifully analyzed it for us, that how the legal system is adversarial in nature. There's always A versus B. We've also sort of made parliamentary systems adversarial in nature, where they're supposed to be more collaborative, they're supposed to be more collaborative, they're supposed to be working together with each other, and that's the larger paradox. The parliament was essentially supposed to be a collective representation of will and not just a clash of ideologies for the sake of clashing of ideologies. And on that note, sir, with your permission, I'd like to begin the first theme, if that's okay with you, sir.
Sure.
Right, sir. So the first question to you is sir, for example, we take a couple of very specific ways. You spoke about the labor codes. Now, as you would know, the government of today has passed a plethora of labor policy legislation, from the Code of Social Security to the Code of Wages. A lot of it is in the pipeline for that matter. Some have been passed, some of them are in the pipeline. When we speak about the very notorious passage of the Aadhaar bill, which magically became a money bill, and the Supreme Court also sort of laid their hands off the office of the Speaker, to most recently, the agricultural ordinance, which was converted into a bill in less than 10 minutes of discussion. It was all done within a week. So the larger question is, when you have a majoritarian government, the houses become compliant. When you don't have a majoritarian government, the houses become non-competent. So where do we understand this? So I mean, if you think of it, we're quite in a paradox, sir.
Yeah, I think the majority doesn't need to be that way, because the truth is that if you look at other parliamentary systems like the British, Australian, New Zealand, Canadian, or if you look at our own practice in the early days under Nehruji, you actually had a crushing majority for Nehruji, but you had a tremendous amount of debate and discussion because he encouraged his own party backbenchers to challenge his government. You could think of Jawaharlal Nehru being attacked by Feroz Gandhi. You could think of Finance Minister P.T. Krishnamachari being forced to resign by Congress backbenchers, challenging him on a couple of decisions that seemed to imply some financial impropriety. You can remember the famous story during the 92 war with China. 1962 war with China, I beg your pardon. The 1962 war with China, it came up quite recently as an example because of the fact that we were looking at the need for discussing China in Parliament today, and we have unfortunately not been allowed to do so. But in 1962, Nehruji responded to Mr. Vajpayee's request for a parliamentary discussion, had a full debate even while the war was raging, attended himself, answered questions, and at one point a Congress backbencher reacted to Nehruji saying about Aksai Chin, not a blade of grass grows there. That was about the territory the Chinese had taken. He's saying basically there's no one living there, there's no vegetation, nothing's growing there. And this gentleman, a congressman, Mr. Mishra, I think his name was, stood up pointed to his own bald head and said, "Not a hair grows on my head, will you give this to China too?" This is a backbencher talking to his own prime minister. Now, that kind of thing is no longer possible. Today, conformity rules the roost. And I would argue that the reason this is so is the anti-defection bill. Now, I'm happy to explain that at some length, but I just want to say that a crushing majority doesn't automatically mean that you don't have discussion or dissent. But in today's India, with the way our things have gone, we have absolutely no dissent being brooked. And certainly I know for a fact that with this present government, every single bill, their majority is told how to vote. And therefore, there is never any doubt that anything the BJP government wants to get through the parliament will be got through because their majority will vote as they are told. And that is a far cry from the days of Jawaharlal Nehru and certainly from the way in which the system works in other countries. In Britain, for example, I'm not a big fan of Britain, as you all know. I mean, I'm somewhat notorious for my criticisms of that country, and I'm not even a fan of the way in which these things come to us, including our sort of copy-paste of the parliamentary system, which I think, frankly, was ill-suited to the Indian temperament. But anyway, in the UK, where the system originated, no whip was issued, even on so fundamental a vote as to whether to authorize the government to proceed with the Brexit negotiations. No whip was issued on whether the UK should support the US in the Iraq war. Dissent was freely and honestly expressed on both sides of the aisle. So you could actually have, for example, the Labour Party government deciding to support the Americans in the war, and Labour Party members disagreeing, including the Labour Party's own foreign secretary, member of the government, said, "I disagree with the Prime Minister." You've seen him resign over that issue. And later, in a subsequent debate when Labour was in the opposition, you saw the shadow foreign secretary resign, similarly on a disagreement with the party on a particular issue. But dissent is freely and honestly expressed on both sides of the aisle. And that kind of freedom is unknown to the Indian MP. So it's not that majority systems automatically give us this outcome, as the question on the screen asks. It is that the way in which our majority system works in the Indian context necessarily does mean a totally compliant legislature. Legislature, I'll stop.
Right, sir. So, in fact, this sort of question paves our way into the anti-defection law question that I think we've been hovering around for a bit. And you did mention the UK example, sir. I mean, most recently, if you sort of draw our attention to the whole Brexit debates that happened, and you would remember when Theresa May had presented her Brexit plan, it was her own party MPs who rejected her idea. And then there was an opportune moment for a no confidence, which she won and she remained. So the beauty of democracy was that the party members of the Theresa May government disagreed with her prime minister's way of Brexit, but had absolute faith in the leadership of their prime minister. And that sort of is the beauty of the parliamentary system of government. And that's something that we would often want to look at. And when you do very rightly say that we do, in fact, do a cut, copy, paste of the Westminster form of parliament because, well, it sounds fancy and we should do it. In fact, the original Westminster's form of parliamentary government never ever had the idea of penalizing defection in the first place. In fact, if we look at most of the Western part of the world, most of the Western developed democracies, they don't have anything called an anti-defection law. In fact, it is usually the South Asian belt, it's usually countries like India, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and to an extent the South African part of the world, which actually have anti-defection laws. So the larger question still becomes that are colonies or former colonies insecure that we have to protect our interests? And India did not start out with an anti-defection law. It is because of the 70s where, almost half of our MPs and MLAs had changed their party once. We've all heard of the Aya Ram Gaya Ram joke, where the man is a legend in UPSC circles and across political circles, where the man changed, some 3 political parties in one day, like for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And that's most that, most people get, which sort of leads me to the next question, sir. So on one hand is the individuality of a legislator. Like, for example, I do distinctly remember after the Supreme Court judgment on homosexuality, you had attempted to introduce a private member bill on homosexuality. And I do remember hearing your speech on the floor of the Parliament, where you categorically had said, what you're essentially doing is implementing the Supreme Court's direction. The Supreme Court has asked the Parliament to legislate on homosexuality, and because it was a private member bill, and private member bills are nothing but ego questions to the majority government, no matter who's in power, really. So the larger question then became, it sort of stifled up. The same way Manish Tiwari, if I remember, as a Congress MP, wanted to introduce a private member bill on reforms to anti-defection law, which is also tabled. The last time a private member bill was ever on the floor of the House is the time that most of the aspirants watching this were not even born. So it's that archaic as an idea.
It's not that bad, actually. The private members bills come up. In the case of my bill, what was unique about that experience is that it is the only bill in the history of our Parliament to have been opposed and defeated at the introduction stage.
Right.
What happens at private member bills normally is they're introduced without any debate or controversy, and then they sink without trace. They never come up to the floor for discussion. At most, one or two bills are discussed a year, but every year at least one or two are discussed by lot and by the favoritism of the committee that decides which ones will be discussed. But yeah, this bill was defeated before. I mean, and not just once, but twice, which is why I gave up. Sorry, go ahead.
So, but in the sense that for example, a cursory reading of parliamentary procedures do tell us that I think on Fridays, the last 2.5 hours are reserved for private member bill discussions on the floor of the House.
Not every Friday. Sometimes every second or third Friday, yeah.
It truly is the thank God it's Friday, moment on alternate Fridays. So the larger question is that enough? Do you think we need to do more for encouraging private member bills? Because we really aren't doing much.
Sure, no, I do believe so. But let me start with the question on your screen about the anti-defection law. Right. I do want to start out by saying it was passed with good intentions, the same good intentions with which, according to the proverb, the road to hell is paved. Good intentions. It was intended, as you rightly said, to stop the ayaram gayaram practice of legislators crossing the floor in pursuit of power and pelf. And as a result of that, by the way, state governments and 2 central governments fell between 67 and 85, entirely because of floor crossing and so on. So the idea was noble. It rested on a sound principle. Governmental stability matters. People must stay loyal to the party on whose platform they contested. The intent of the voters must not be betrayed by defections. So when the law was first explained by its proponents, there was widespread support, even enthusiasm for its passage. And as you know, Rajiv Gandhi was Prime Minister when he passed it for all these good reasons. But how has the Act worked in practice? It has dramatically reduced defections, but not eliminated them. We've seen this in many states, Uttarakhand, Manipur, Gujarat, UP, Madhya Pradesh, all sorts of places. Defections have still been happening in one form or the other. But what the anti-defection law has done is effectively to stifle the voice of the individual legislator. Since every single vote in Parliament sees a whip being issued, however trivial the subject of the bill, there is no room for honest differences of opinion. Disobeying a whip offers grounds not just for disciplinary action by the party, but expulsion from Parliament altogether. And no MP who has struggled and strived and spent to get elected to his seat is likely going to place his seat in jeopardy. His convictions become secondary to the party line. So the argumentative Indian is often on display in both houses, but only when that argumentative Indian is arguing strictly according to his party's position. So as a result, the anti-defection law has reduced each MP to a cipher during every vote, a number to be totted up by his party whip, rather than an individual of ability, conviction, and conscience. Now, this outcome has other effects. It reduces the need for each MP to study an issue thoroughly and come to a position on it, since his position no longer matters unless he's part of the party leadership. In my experience, most MPs only study the bills they're assigned to speak on. The rest just sees them coming and voting dutifully as their whip tells them to. And this is a travesty of the process, as I've explained already. In fact, the truth is that there are really no secret ballots now, except, of course, for constitutional amendments. But even that's not really secret, because you can see the light shining up against the seat numbers on the bulletin board, so people know. that even though they didn't have to raise their hands or speak, who voted where, which person sitting on which seat voted in what way on a constitutional amendment. So in fact, any dissenting vote is noted. It is an act of defiance. Under the anti-defection law, it will automatically attract sanctions. And of course, what's interesting is that the main provisions of our constitution regarding the legislature were silent about the party system. In fact, you could argue that the addition of the anti-defection clause in 1985 was patently illogical, since it sought to punish the undermining of an institution, the party, which was itself not mentioned in the main provisions of the Constitution. So can you imagine a constitution that doesn't mention political parties is punishing people for violating the interests of their political parties? You can ask, did the founders ever intend the party system to be paramount over the individual parliamentarian, obliging him to subordinate his conscience to the party whip? Now, there are no real answers to this, but I think one such answer might be to amend the anti-defection law to ensure that party whips can only be issued for specific kinds of questions, those involving the survival of the government, perhaps, money bills. In a government, in our system, if you can't successfully pass your budget, you have to resign. So you can understand that a ruling party has the right to impose a whip that everybody in the party has to vote for the budget because the government has to survive. But on other subjects, the surrogacy bill, for example, or labor codes, or the farm bills, let's have more open discussion on these subjects. So, it's true, already it's much more doubtful that any MP would openly vote against his party line, even on a minor issue. Because, of course, even if a vote no longer would attract disqualification under a reform system, it would attract the disapproval of his party leadership. And that would be disincentive enough for most parliamentarians. But I think what's important for us to say is we need to find some way to let individual MPs actually have a view on issues that they have thought through, they've studied, they have their own ideas, their own experience, and then to not attract the provisions of the anti-defection law in the process. Now, you just asked me another question, which wasn't the question on the screen, and I've promptly forgotten it. Can you summarize it?
So the question is, what could we do to make sure that private member bills are encouraged and go through the floor of the House in a lot more detail and discussion?
Oh, I think first of all, you are absolutely right in saying that Friday afternoons are a bad time to discuss anything serious. First of all, most of us whose constituencies are far away tend to skip on Friday afternoon and go and catch a flight because we have to work Saturday and Sunday in the constituency. And so people like me, Thiruvananthapuram, it takes me over 4 hours. If I have a direct flight, I've got to change planes. It takes me over 5 hours, airport to airport, plus the time at either end. There's no question of my not wanting to be around because obviously I want to get 2 full days work on Saturday and Sunday in my constituency. So Friday afternoons are bad for that reason. Secondly, we need to have them more often. Very often in an entire 4 or 5 week session, there may be only one Friday afternoon available. And therefore some of us may not even be able to introduce our private member bills in that time. Third, a larger number of them ought to be discussed. I would be in favor of giving an entire day over for discussion of private members' bills, a sort of 10 to 6 kind of day, so that at least half a dozen bills can be brought up for, say, 1 hour discussions each, and that MPs are able to explain their logic and people are listening, and there should be a convention or even a rule that at least one minister from the government should be present to listen to a debate and see whether the ideas being offered are actually worth considering and taking on from the point of view of the government. By the way, I'm pleased to say many private members' bills have been adopted by the government. When they realize that an idea is good or it's gaining traction, they will tend to go around and say, listen, you give it to us, we will put it in forms that we can find comfortable as a government and we'll bring it back. And sometimes they do that. So in fact, though you're saying accurately that very few private members' bills have been passed, the substance of the ideas has often come back in the form of government bills. So that's another reform. But I am very much in favor of this because it also privileges that first thing we talked about, that is the individual conscience, experience, judgment, and ability of the individual MP. Because that is what is missing in the way our parliamentary system works now.
Right, sir. So, in fact, so just because you can issue a whip doesn't mean you should issue a whip. I think that would be the essence of how we could sort of reform the way anti-defection law could work, because whips are essentially something which people have to follow under all circumstances, and also increasing the amount of time that we could give to private member bills, and also largely being open to just hearing people out. And as you rightly said, and that's I think the quote of the day, is that disapproval is more dangerous than disqualification. And given how politics is in India, it means a lot more to be disapproved by your political friends than to be disqualified, because as we have seen, and in fact that even if somebody gets disqualified after being on the grounds of anti-defection law, you can always recontest from any other political party, or even the same political party, or even as an independent candidate, and sort of come back. And with that said, on the larger thematic discussion of accountability, because at the end of the day, the parliament is the one with the highest democratic mandate, the temple of democracy, quote unquote, without any pun intended whatsoever, to a leader of office in the country. Now, having said that, sir, what we're largely looking at is the government over a period of time has, and across the board, and I say this for governments across the board, whether we look at changes to FCRA legislations or electoral bonds, or we look at the way right to educate, the right to information commissioners have been sort of not treated the way they were treated previously, or we look at the larger powers of regulatory agencies, whether it is the telecom regulatory or the securities exchange. We may create one after the other, but the larger question is, and a fundamental agreement has been, it is also discussed in the Constituent Assembly debates, is the only way to make regulatory agencies more accountable is to actually give the parliament more powers to ask them a question as to what you're doing, is it right or wrong? Now, sir, do you sort of subscribe to the view, or because anything else done outside the purview of the parliament would largely be a biased exercise? It's like me eating the cake and having it too, and by my physical dimension, I can tell you I love a lot of cake.
So do I, have to confess, Mr. Mathur. Well, let me say that regulators really are a very strange phenomenon, because they actually combine all the three branches of government in one. They have the powers to legislate, as a parliament does, because they're essentially making rules, norms, laws, in fact, in the shape of subordinate legislation. They're also the executive, because they're the ones who execute the rules that they pronounce, rather like the political executive. And then they're also the court of last appeal for their own actions, so they're like the judiciary. And therefore, you can argue that regulatory authorities are like a sort of state in themselves, because they're a combination of legislature, executive, and judiciary. Now, they obviously have to discharge their duties in the interest of all stakeholders, which means all the citizens of the country. That's the logic as to why they're created. I would say the Telecoms Regulatory Authority is created with the interests of the telecoms operators, as well as the telecoms consumers, as well as the state governments, as well as the central government, etc., and the armed forces, all to be kept in mind. And that's the way in which regulators are supposed to work. And they have the overall responsibility for the governance of the sector they're supposed to regulate. And of course, they should do so, ideally, within the broader framework of the nation's interests and the state government, and the state's objectives. Now, creating a level playing field is a classic responsibility of a regulator. Eliminating subjectivity in the way that the free market works is also important, so that they can actually make decisions to give everybody a fair shake, whether it's telecoms, whether it's banking. I mean, the regulations exist in pretty much every sector, right? What you have is a broad framework of authority and autonomy in which a regulator can intervene. And the truth is that in all of these, I'm afraid there is really no oversight. They are a law unto themselves. I certainly would agree with those who are suggesting that one way in which we can look at these independent regulators would be to subject them to the scrutiny of a parliamentary committee. And if that were the case on a regular basis, then, I mean, I do say, I should have clarified, parliamentary committees may summon regulators and ask them questions. But since parliamentary committees themselves are only advisory, at most what they can do is make a comment into the main parliament and to the government, which may or may not be discussed or taken up. A more tighter, more formal arrangement might make a constructive sort of difference. One could even argue that the Reserve Bank of India is actually a regulatory authority, and that they can be summoned before the Finance Committee of Parliament and ask questions is a good thing. But I don't really think that either the Finance Committee or the RBI think that the parliamentarians in the Finance Committee have any authority over the RBI. So there is a very limited sort of scrutiny that takes place.
And it's always very interesting to see the dynamics between the RBI and the Finance Ministry as the classic growth development trade-off, and they are lions of their own jungle, and there's always a very inherent a chemistry battle between the both, and there'll always be something or the other that's always clashing. But so you made a very, very interesting point on how parliamentary committees themselves are fundamentally advisory in nature. And I'd like to take your permission to sort of now move into the larger parliamentary committee question, if I may so, sir. Right. So let's take a few examples in front of us. We would remember, so you are a member of the Parliamentary Committee on Information Technology, and well, we are currently battling with the larger policy issue of privacy, and only the gods above can possibly help us on that front because of the legislations that we sort of look at. But the larger question, sir, sort of here is, when we look at the US, we see a Google CEO being called, Mark Zuckerberg being called. We see Justice Kavanaugh being questioned, and these are televised debates. You would remember the Murdoch investigation in the UK. So or even in movies, you see a movie called Iron Man, where he opens up with a parliamentary committee, and it is also dramatic. It's theatrical. It still seems fancy enough for us to believe it. The larger question is, what can we do to make sure parliamentary committees get better, apart from the fact that they're just advisory in nature?
Well, I think you're 100% correct on that. I mean, and of course, you're right. By design, they're only meant to be advisory, whereas they've been given far more authority. For example, the best known system is the US system, which is really not parliamentary. The Congress has a slightly more significant role than parliaments do, but they are, in fact, quite authoritative, and their capacity to question, to subpoena, to even to arrest is quite serious. Now, when it comes to the parliamentary system, we have taken, honestly, a very minimal view in our country. For example, all parliament deliberations are done behind closed doors, and that creates a very invidious position. First of all, they're meant to be confidential until a report is presented to Parliament on the subject of discussion, which means normally, it means that nobody can speak to the media. In practice, it means that people issue motivated leaks, either to promote the point of view they were advocating in the committee, or to push their party line, or simply to damage the other side in a controversy. So that's happening routinely. Every time that you read an article in the newspaper about somebody saying something to a parliamentary committee or in a parliamentary committee, let me tell you, you're reading an unauthorized leak, because parliamentary committees are not authorized to brief the media until such time as their reports on that particular subject are submitted to Parliament. So that's the first, I think, serious reform worth making, which is to lift this restriction. As in other democracies, let us have parliamentary committees meeting in such a way that their deliberations are open for the public to see. I wouldn't even mind them being televised. I know what the obvious answer is, which is, oh, wait a minute, then people will start grandstanding again. You'll have disruptions, you'll have walkouts, you'll have all the stuff that goes on in the regular parliament after that started getting televised. And my counter answer is, if people do that, number one, it will disgrace them in the eyes of the watching public. But number two, they will be the ones foregoing an opportunity to actually use the extraordinary detailed mechanisms available in the parliamentary committees to go into the substance of any particular issue. So I think the disapproval by the public of this kind of behavior would be enough to minimize it or perhaps even end it. So I would be in favor, number one, of opening up the committees to public awareness and even conceivably televising them, at the very least allowing journalists to sit without, of course, anyone being able to intervene in what is still a closed-door process. But just as journalists cover Parliament, they could cover parliamentary committees. Second, to enhance participation in these committees, I would insist upon a virtual participation also being made possible. Right now, the government and the parliaments, both houses of parliament, have a strict rule that only physical meetings can take place. And as a result of that, very often, particularly during COVID and the quarantine, very many people were unable to come. Initially, in the early days of the lockdown, MPs would say to me, how can I come to your meeting when I have to go through 2 weeks of quarantine in Delhi before I attend the meetings? We interviewed with the Delhi government, got that requirement lifted. And then the people said to me, the MP said to me, that's not enough, because if I go back to my state, they insist on 2 weeks of quarantine after I come back from Delhi. So the result was, for a couple of months, very difficult to get a quorum. And I asked the Speaker, could we not connect these outstation MPs virtually? And the answer came no, because of the principle of confidentiality. So the confidentiality even affects participation. A third way it can be improved is that right now, because of these restrictions on participation and confidentiality, the quorum requirement can be a burden in itself. Now here there is a discrepancy between the Rajya Sabha rule and the Lok Sabha rule, which is itself strange, because all committees in our system are committees of both the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha. So both houses are present. But we have a strange, peculiar thing that when a committee is chaired by a Lok Sabha member, it's called a Lok Sabha committee. When it's chaired by a Rajya Sabha member, it's called a Rajya Sabha committee, even though, in fact, both houses are represented in these committees. And the result of at the end of the day was what? That you have a Rajya Sabha telling its chairpersons, okay, you can overlook the quorum as long as you're not taking a decision. When you're taking a formal decision like adopting a report, then you have to have a quorum. But having a briefing meeting or a discussion on an issue on your agenda, don't worry about the quorum. I would love to do that in the Lok Sabha committees, but there the rules say the opposite, that if you don't have a quorum, you'll have to suspend the meeting. And needless to say, in my committee, all committees have the representation is on the basis of strength of parties in Parliament. So the ruling party is most represented in every committee. And the ruling party MP has been very clear in making me call off meetings when I had only 8 members present and the quorum is 10. They would insist that I have to call off a meeting, and we've lost 2 or 3 meetings for that reason. And there are other discrepancies in the administrative rules between the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha Secretariat that led me to call on the new Lok Sabha Secretary General just yesterday and have a very serious discussion with him on Thursday. I had a very serious discussion with him about how to resolve some of these discrepancies. So on the whole, I will say that various reforms are possible. We should also require, in practice, that every bill should be referred to a committee, and that if an exception is made, an explanation will have to be given to the Speaker and laid on the table of the House as to why a bill was so urgent that it could not be referred to a committee. That would massively improve the quality of legislation. The committees can be put to work looking into the details of each piece of legislation. And given, as I described to you all earlier, how, frankly, how questioning a lot of the debate on the floor of Parliament is, let at least some real questioning happen in the committee itself. And that, I think, would make a very constructive requirement. In fact, at the moment, we have an appallingly low percentage of bills being referred to parliamentary committees. I think that there should be a norm, and maybe something like saying 80% of bills, and if the government fails to refer 80% of bills to committees, it will have to provide an explanation in writing to the public, to the Speaker, on the floor of the House, etc., as to why they didn't do that. That, I think, would be the other reform that could strengthen parliamentary committees and make them useful.
So, right. So, in fact, it's very interesting if you could draw like a sort of an analogy from the judiciary. You would remember through the National Judicial Appointments Commission, the entire judiciary was put into a corner, and then they self-judicially reviewed itself, and then they said the National Judicial Appointments Commission violates basic structure because we made basic structure and our independence is supreme. And as a little bit of a candy to the country, they said we're going to now have collegium proceedings being published online. Now, the judiciary, which is as archaic gets in the way they function, and especially in the time of the pandemic, you would see, several high courts most happily running multiple, video conferencing facilities. I believe the Gujarat High Court also has a YouTube streaming of their live proceedings, which honestly makes for great entertainment half of the time, sir. But it's great to see, things being out there. So why not also extend it to, the parliamentary scheme of things? The second irony behind this would be, sir, in the context of the pandemic, we've been hosting multilateral meets, we've been hosting multi-country dialogues with the rest of the world. If we can do that with countries in all parts of the globe, why can't we do that for parliamentarians who could still be sitting safely in their constituencies, hopefully working? Because the analogies make sense. If it could happen for the judiciary, if it could happen for an ASEAN, why can't it happen for the parliament in general, which is essentially what you said. And also, as you said, we should have more bills referred, we should have a longer tenure. And as you would know, for example, you've been an ardent supporter of something called the LAMP Fellowship, where MPs often given, legislative assistance. So, something like in the West, parliament people who get to intern for parliamentary committees is a stepping stone for their career as as becoming advisors and consultants to leading parties and politicians. I think we could also have research assistants to parliamentary committees. Of course, we can leave their phones at the door because, well, privacy is fundamental after all. But the larger discussion is that we could definitely have more research assistants and make parliamentary committees work. So I believe we are running out of time, and if I just have your permission for a very specific policy-based question, and we take up a couple of questions if you're up for it, and then we'll call it a closer. May I have a question on the same, sir?
Go ahead, Atish Mathur. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I have a very, very specific question, sir. We've recently passed the Transgenders Act, and most people in the country think transgenders mean people with both genders. Transgender is more of a gender identification idea, who you are and what you feel like, and the idea is to give them a sense of recognition by also giving them certain reservation benefits. And of course, from the women angle, we've given 33% reservation to women in our local self-governments, which, well, has been implemented to an extent, but the larger concept of what is called Sarpanch Pati or Sabhapati, where the female might just be elected, but it's the male counterpart. The kingmaker is actually the king, or the queenmaker is actually the king, those things happens. So there has been a policy discussion. Should women and transgenders get reservation in the parliament? Do you think that makes sense?
Well, my party supports the women's reservation bill, which actually passed the Rajya Sabha. And because the Rajya Sabha theoretically never expires, the bill is still live, and all the government has to do, if it's serious about it, is to bring it into the Lok Sabha and get it passed. In fact, when the bill was passed in the Rajya Sabha, an overwhelming majority, including both the BJP and the Congress, voted for it. So I think certainly the question of reservation for women is in theory agreed, accepted, supported by both the major parties in the country and many of the smaller parties and regional parties. But nonetheless, there seems to be a reluctance to make the final leap and bring it to a vote, which is a good question as to why that should be the case. Even though, unfortunately, there is no political traction so far behind it, I would argue that you could certainly imagine women getting reservations before too long. It's worked in panchayat elections. In many, many cases, you simply have a constituency reserved for women candidates. In many cases, 1/3 of the constituencies and 1/2 of the panchayat presidencies or chairmanships are reserved for women in many states. In my state of Kerala, that is the case. And therefore, you can use reservations as a tool to promote social progress. And that's obviously a very desirable objective. For transgenders, there is no draft legislation yet. It was only as late as the 2011 census that transgenders were even enumerated. And now that there is an indication that there are very high percentages of people, for example, UP, according to the 2011 census, 28% of the population of UP is actually transgender, which is quite astonishing. Tamil Nadu is 4.5%, Andhra Pradesh is 8.9%. You're talking about significant numbers of people. And if that is the case, then certainly one should discuss the possibility of some sort of reservations for them too. But I think politically, if we are going to try and first get the women's reservation through, because we've taken a step forward, see if that works before we get others in, because the hesitation you'll get from male politicians, let's put it very bluntly, is precisely that the more categories there's reservation for, the less opportunities they have. And let's face it, one of the parties that is well known for being a strong advocate of OBCs objected to the women's reservation bill by saying that this is actually a ploy for giving upper caste women opportunities at the expense of lower caste men. And this kind of argument politically can be enough to kill any bill. So I think we need to be able to take all parties along with us, get the bill moving in the houses. But I do want to stress that as far as we're concerned in the Congress party, we are genuinely with the public wish to see women represented in Parliament. I really think it's a disgrace that we have as few women in Parliament as we do, given the fact that in our country, women have to bear such a high burden of so many of the essential responsibilities that lead to our economic growth, our social progress. We have women in every sector now, including the military. Why don't we have more women in Parliament? Why are we still stuck at 10, 11% when we have half our population women? I don't think there are any really good answers. And that's why, in my honest view, we need to come up with some serious, shall we say, examinations of these issues. And we should ideally take the women's reservation bill that's already gone through one house and get it through the other.
Right, sir. Also, with the fact that it could at least be reintroduced, if not it's being lapsed, I think that could still be done. There's an opportunity for that to happen in the first place. And as you rightly said, sir, if legally speaking, the justification for giving reservation is always social or educational backwardness, as long as we can statistically prove that women are socially or educationally backward in a country like India, it would definitely. Sir, I do believe we've been speaking for a fair bit of time, and I do believe, would you like to take a question or two and would like to wrap this up, sir? Would that be okay with you?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Right.
No, I'm conscious that some people had to wait a while, therefore, if they're still connected, we owe them a full hour. So let's go on.
There are thousands of people who are connected at the moment, and there are some very interesting questions, sir. And apart from them, I'm sure you're sick and tired of hearing a question that says, "Do I need to bring a dictionary along?" And I'm going to keep those questions aside, sir. Those are irrelevant questions. Because I remember in one of your interviews, you very clearly said somebody asked you, "What do we do to improve our English?" And you said, "Simply read." And some of the Yes, what are the nicest things you could do when that's all that is absolutely needed? So a question from a student called Abhinav is, what is your opinion on the shadow form of government? Do you think it really makes governance better? Does it create more accountability? Does it really help making the system or the process better? Sir?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that shadow cabinets are a very interesting idea. Part of the difficulty in India, frankly, is that given the very modest representation in Parliament of many parties, whether they'll have enough numbers to put up a credible shadow cabinet. In the British system, for example, because the Parliament is 650 people, even when the Labour Party was clobbered in the election, it still had almost 200 MPs. So actually creating a shadow cabinet for every portfolio made sense, whereas when we got clobbered, we had about 50 MPs, or 44 once and 52 the next time. And actually having a cabinet from those MPs would have probably looked, questionable to some. I would still be in favor. I think it doesn't matter, even if the person who got elected may not necessarily be the person who actually gets that ministership if you ever come to power. At least that person is obliged then to follow the subject carefully, master the issues, challenge the government on those issues. So I am in favor of a shadow cabinet system. The logic of the shadow cabinet system is precisely that the opposition demonstrates its expertise on issues of governance. Because in a parliamentary system, your entire logic is to say, this is, the government of India, But here is the government in waiting that hopes and intends to replace them one day. And these are the policies that this government in waiting will argue for. So yes, I'm in favor of a shadow cabinet to do exactly that.
Right, sir. Right, sir. So on that note, we'd like to wrap this up. And if I have your permission to conclude, sir, it has been an absolute honor. I've been a fan of you growing up, and I still have a long way. In your very first TEDx speech that you had given, which went viral, and then you were the synthesis of being cool and being suave for the country. One of the most interesting things that you said was there's a difference in being well educated and well informed. And as you know, more than 70%, 75% of the country, of 75% of our MPs are graduates. They might be well educated, but they're certainly not well informed, especially the kind of things that are said in and around. So it has been an absolute honor. It's been a privilege. So thank you so much for taking some precious time. I know you've been too busy with a lot of work. Thank you so much, sir. Keep writing. Sir, keep talking. There's an entire nation that awaits to hear you, sir. Always, sir.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking to Mr. Mathur. Keep up the good work yourself. Thanks for all the kind words, and my best wishes to all the young people who are listening in, particularly those who intend to take the UPSC exam. I wish them luck. We can do with people who are intellectually curious, who are adaptable, who are open-minded coming into our government service. So good luck to all of you young folks, and thank you once again to Unacademy and the Hindu.
Good evening, sir. Thank you, sir. Right, sir.